Welcome to the ACT podcast. Today we are thinking about the government's latest attempt to legislate on so-called conversion practices. And this could have significant implications for Christians, including those working in education. Now, this issue raises important questions about how schools navigate complex conversations around identity, sexuality, pastoral care. Today, we are joined by Simon Calvert of the Christian Institute to explore what this proposed legislation actually says, or what it will say, why this attempt may differ from previous ones, and what it could mean for Christian parents, church leaders, and teachers. So thank you, Simon, for joining us. Great to have you with us.
It's a pleasure.
Simon, just tell us very briefly, what does the Christian Institute do? I'm sure many of our listeners will know, but who are you? What do you do?
Christian Institute has been around since the early 90s. We are a Christian campaign organisation, primarily church-facing, in as much as we do hundreds of meetings, I think sometimes up to 400 meetings a year, where we have different members of staff getting face-to-face with our supporters and with new people, helping them to get to grips with what the Bible has to say about some of the hot button issues of the day. So things like abortion and euthanasia, issues like gambling or vice, things like how to respond to the LGBTQ movement, issues of freedom of speech, drugs, and things like that. So we're helping Christians to understand what the faith has to say about those things, because a lot of those things are under pressure in our current culture. Of course, there are many other issues that Christians should be concerned about, but we have this sort of canon of issues where we have decades of expertise in helping Christians to get to grips with what the Bible has to say, and also to encourage them to be active, to be involved, to be speaking out. And so, for example, specifically in the realm of education, we have 3 members of staff whose job all day, every day is to respond to requests for help from teachers, governors, and parents in connection with things going on in schools. And our approach is that, of course, we need to be prepared to stand against the tide when people are proposing to do things that are clearly wrong and damaging. But we think that the approach that Christians should take should be to be as constructive as possible, and actually to try and be involved in schools and in other areas of life before the problems start, in order to try and be a salt and light influence. And so lastly, that also includes engaging with the political process, engaging with the lawmaking process at a national level, both with the UK Parliament and the national parliaments, and also at a local level. And so my job in particular, I've been at the Christian Institute 30 years, believe it or not, is to help to represent what Christians have to say directly with politicians and to the media. And one of the great joys, actually, of what I do is getting to work with Christians and non-Christians outside of the Institute who will share our view on a particular issue. And I get to work closely with them to try and bring about positive change.
Excellent. Well, I know many of us deeply value the work you do. And I think it's really helpful that you kind of you inferred there that actually the work of the Christian Institute is really, I wouldn't say the last step in the sort of journey for Christians in influencing their context, but actually most Christians, if they are involved and they are courageous and gracious, can actually really influence and be a positive sort of conduit for information and change in their local context, in schools in particular. I always say that we need as many Christian governors in particular, actually. I think that's a vital role. And I really value the help and support and the expertise, particularly of John, who heads up your education team. And I know there's David there as well. And the reason we're talking to you today, Simon, is mainly because you're leading the work of the Christian Institute on the so-called conversion therapy or conversion practices bill. So you're really expert in that. And that's something that I think that perhaps in the education arena, maybe many Christians aren't completely aware of the potential impact. So there have been several attempts over a number of years to legislate on so-called conversion therapy or conversion practices. Could you tell us what is the government proposing this time? What do they mean? What are conversion practices? And how does this latest draft differ perhaps from previous proposals?
Yeah. Well, the specific proposal this time round is to criminalize what they are calling abusive conversion practices. And it's important to stop at this point and to consider, firstly, what it is as Christians that we do want to advocate and defend, and what it is that we don't want to advocate and defend. And the fact is that over the years, as Christians, we have seen many legislative and policy changes where, on the face of it, the language that politicians and campaigners are using is the language of compassion and the language of protecting people from abuse. And as Christians, we instinctively want to stand four square with those who advocate compassion and who want to protect the vulnerable from abuse. And I would say Christians have got a long and honourable track record of being involved in protecting the vulnerable from abuse. If you trace UK history of legislation, for example, protecting children, whether it's Shaftesbury's work in the factories or whether it's the later work to protect children from sexual abuse and that Josephine Butler did and so on. Christians have always been at the forefront of that sort of thing. So it's very confusing, it's very discombobulating for Christians when somebody stands up to say we want to protect people from abusive conversion practices, and then they hear us saying hang about, because they think, well, why wouldn't we want to protect people? And the answer is that if words had their ordinary meaning, there would be no problem. But in this context, words do not have their ordinary meaning. And I have to say, I think probably a lot of Christians now, we're used to that. We're used to, for example, the language of safeguarding being weaponized. Are we in favor of safeguarding? 100%. But what do people mean, particularly today, when they say safeguarding? What they often have is a particular political goal that they want to achieve, a political cause that they want to advance, and they don't want you getting in the way. So they tell you that that their goal, that their political aim is cloaked in safeguarding, when in fact it's not. And I think perhaps we could use the issue of gender ideology as a prime example of that. That people say that it's safeguarding to enable a child who is female to present as male at school, even though that child has many undiagnosed issues which clearly need addressing. The child's parents are not going along with that. And in fact, there are real safeguarding reasons not to do that. And we've seen that shift, haven't we, even in education, from non-affirming to wildly over-affirming. And then the pendulum is swinging back to, I mean, I'm using their language, the non-affirming, or the, better to say, sex realist point of view, which is far better. So I'm just using that as an example to illustrate, we're used to people weaponizing language like safeguarding and abuse in order to try and shut us up when we simply want to do the right thing and to stand against an agenda. So that's a long-winded way of getting around to the point that conversion therapy is in that realm. Because if somebody is experiencing verbal or physical abuse of any kind, in any kind of setting, in the home, in a church, in a school, in public, there are, and I could list them if you want, plenty of laws that can and should be used to protect those people from that abuse. And we see enough stories in the news of people being prosecuted for things that they have said, things which fall a long way short of violence, being prosecuted for things that they have said under existing law. So we know that verbally abusive comments can be prosecuted. And of course, we know that anything physically abusive can be prosecuted. So when people say that they want a conversion therapy law, and stop me if I'm going on too long about this, but when they say that they want a conversion therapy law, the kind of stories that they will tell will be things like, well, this man went for therapy and was given electroshock therapy. And you find out that was in the 1950s or the 1960s. And so you think, well, that doesn't happen anymore, thankfully. So why are we talking about that? Or they will tell you, well, that somebody was held down and prayed for against their will. I've
Mm.
never been anywhere near a church that does anything like that. But if
Mm.
that would happen in front of you or me,
Mm.
somebody was held down, we would know that we must take that person to the police to help them report that they've been physically abused. But again, I say that I don't think that's happening in our churches, thankfully. So why are they telling these stories? Well, they're telling these stories to sort of harness public sympathy, because at the end of the day, the laws that they really want are laws to stop us expressing opinions. What
Yeah.
they really want is a speech crime. And that is what we have got in this draft conversion practices bill. And it will be good to come back to this question of it being draft, whereby if somebody carries on any conduct towards an individual with, and the wording is weird, with the intention of causing them to have or not to have, or to believe that they have or don't have a particular sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, that weird sort of formulation of words is unique, and I think lawyers recognize highly problematic, because it's not anything to do with using abusive words, is it? It's not
Mm.
anything to do with holding people down or anything like that. It's to do with ideas. It's to do with
Mm.
what the person believes about gender identity, what they believe about sexual orientation. And that is, in my opinion, squarely in the realms of freedom of speech, because, of course, as
Mm.
Christians, and indeed many non-Christians, we have clear beliefs about sexual ethics and about gender identity, which we can and ought to be, which we ought to be able to express without the threat of criminality.
Okay, thanks, Simon. That's a really helpful kind of overview. And as you say, most people, when they hear the term abusive conversion practices, have all kinds of horrendous images in their mind.
Yeah.
And we've talked about, we've heard, forgive me for the kind of the nature of this, but the idea of corrective rape, even,
Oh, dear
or
me.
or as you say, almost some some coercive and potentially physical forms of prayer that, just like you kind of exemplified, those kinds of horrendous things that are nowhere near really what this bill scratches, because as you say, those kinds of acts are already illegal. So therefore we need to kind of separate what this bill is covering from those horrendous things that are already against the law. So can you tell us then a little bit more, what, first of all, where are we? What's happening with this legislation? Do we have a bill that is kind of ready to go, or is this something that is at the very beginning stage that we really can't grasp yet? And what does it actually say at the moment? You mentioned a few kind of ethereal phrases that I assume
Yeah.
you've taken from it, but yeah, please tell us a bit more.
Yeah. So in terms of where we're at, so yeah, this is a draft bill, and the government has introduced this for something called pre-legislative scrutiny. So normally, when you're reading in the news about a bill, it's a bill that has a first reading where it's briefly introduced in Parliament, a second reading debate where, depending on whether it starts in the Lords or the Commons, peers or MPs will debate the bill at length, the general principles, and then it will go to committee stage and so on and so forth until the Lords and the Commons can agree on a final version of that bill, and it will be passed and it will become an act, and then it will get royal assent and it will become law. That's the normal legislative process. This is pre-legislative. So this bill has not been introduced for that process. It's been introduced so that a joint committee of, I think, a dozen or a dozen and a half MPs and peers drawn from across the political parties, so that they can meet together as a committee, look carefully at the wording that the government is proffering, take evidence, written evidence and oral evidence from experts, and I want to come back to this, about that wording. And then that committee of MPs and peers will produce a written report. And currently, the deadline for them to produce that report is, I think, the 27th of January next year. And what will then happen is the government will go away and read that report and read what they have to say about the bill, any recommendations that the joint committee has about the bill. And then the government will make the decision about whether or not to attempt to proceed with the bill in the normal way. first reading, second reading, and so on. So that's important. Important for a few reasons. One is it shows that there are people in government who know that this is very, very difficult to legislate for. In fact, I think that some of those people in government are realistic enough to expect that the pre-legislative stage of this legislation might cause it to fall apart, because that is what happened under the previous government. We didn't have the PLS stage, but what we did have, I think that Theresa May first made her promise to legislate on conversion therapy in, was it summer 2018 or 2017? Anyway, she made that commitment to TV journalist Paul Brand in the Rose Garden in an interview. And then you spoke to ministers and civil servants about, well, what are you going to do about this conversion therapy thing? And they were basically saying, I don't know why we've committed ourselves to this. This seemed impossible. And, there are existing laws to protect people. And what they saw then, and what we know, and what countless lawyers have told us, is that any new law in this area is, rather than protecting people from abuse, it's simply going to become a speech crime, which tramples all over freedom of speech. And so the previous government, to be fair to them, made multiple kind of good faith attempts to try and come up with some legislation in this space. They took advice from lawyers, they had civil servants work on it, and they couldn't do it. And so I think I'm reasonably hopeful that the pre-legislative stage will reveal the fact that this legislation is, A, not needed because existing law protects people. And by the way, also because the evidence base that the government is relying on is, and I don't want to be rude, but it's an utter joke. It's sort of, it's just stories from activists. It's not a real evidence base that you would normally expect for a government. But B, I think, it's going to become very clear that what this law does do is to criminalize whole swathes of harmless speech that's protected by human rights laws, and a speech which I think once politicians and indeed the public come to understand what is being done here, then they're not going to be okay with it. They're not going to be supportive of it. So that process then will take, as you said, to January next year to produce that report. And we can come back to the issue of the expert evidence if you want, because I think that's somewhere where teachers have an important role. But you asked me to talk about what's actually in the bill. So I want to be fair. So I've said that the basic definition of conversion therapy is any conduct carried out towards an individual with the intention of causing them to have or not to have, or believe that they have or do not have a particular sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's, you are, if anything you do trips that, then technically in law it would be conversion therapy. However, importantly, in order to be guilty of an offence, it also has to be abusive. Now that sounds bad until you see that the definition in the office of what is abusive includes concepts like emotional and economic pressure. Now again, we'll be wary, wouldn't we, if we thought that anybody was using emotional and economic pressure. But here's the thing, as I said a minute ago, words don't have their ordinary meaning. And so we are, as Christians, are used to people taking perfectly innocent, well-intentioned, harmless, good things that we say or do and recasting them as that person's trying to pressure me, they're trying to push me, they're trying to. And so, it is not just Christians who are concerned about this. There are LGBT activists and sex realist activists and many others who are very concerned that this threshold of sort of economic pressure and emotional pressure will be used to mischaracterize and therefore criminalize ordinary parenting.
I think that's something that I'd like to just pick up on for a moment before we even get into what this might mean for teaching professionals, because obviously at ACT, we believe that, the primary educators of a child are their parents, in pretty much, in most circumstances. And I'm very interested in what this could mean then for a parent and child. Presumably, there is no opt-out, there is no protection for a parent having some kind of what could be deemed, abusive, emotionally abusive conversation with their child. Now, just context, yesterday, my daughter, and I'm not trying to belittle or demean true abuse. But my daughter yesterday accused me of hurting her emotionally,
Mm.
of hurting her feelings and making her feel incredibly distressed, and said that I was, yeah, a horrible mum. And and again, I'm not trying to make light of this, but she does get incredibly worked up about a lot of things and quite emotionally volatile. I am just imagining the myriad of obviously much more serious accusations that could come out in families all over the UK, perhaps when children are a little older, when they are a little bit more articulate and they're getting fed
Yeah.
certain things from different avenues, that this would be incredibly easy to for the police, no matter what their intention, if this kind of legislation was successfully made its successful route through Parliament, then there could be no end of investigations of normal parents who are having hard conversations with their
Yeah.
children, or are perhaps, saying that they won't fund certain things. How on earth can we cope, can society cope when with this kind of precariousness around, yeah, normal parental relationships?
Yes, and I mean, some of the activists who we stand shoulder to shoulder with on this issue will say, based on their sort of experience of working directly with people on the other side, that that is what they activists on the other side want. They don't
Mhm.
necessarily mind if there aren't lots of prosecutions, so long as there is a massive chilling effect.
Yeah.
And of course, there would be. And for Christians, there would be, because Christians are law abiding. Christians care about people. We're not perfect by any means, but I think we've been given a bit of a rough ride. I think we should be prepared to say, actually, Christians are quite nice people, and they try quite hard to be kind to people and to be law
Yeah.
abiding. So I think, but that does make us, I think, particularly vulnerable to this chilling effect. And so, I mean, I just want to finish by saying the third part of the test that's in this draft bill is that these abusive conversion practices cause harm. And again, that sounds terrible until you realize that words don't have their ordinary meaning, because it defines harm as including distress that affects someone's day-to-day life. And again, the scenario that of a teenager screaming at the parent, telling them, "You've ruined my life. You
Mm.
never let me do what I want to do. You won't give me the money to do the thing that I want to do. You've taken away all my freedom, and you're trying to stop me being who I am and who I want to be." That doesn't just apply in the area of sexuality or of gender identity, does it? I
No.
mean, in the areas of sexuality and gender identity, those young people who may be very unwise, who may make very poor judgments, can reach out to a considerable, often state-funded
Mm.
network of activists who will validate everything that they say, because from their side of the fence, this helps their politics. This helps
Mm.
them advance their agenda. Their agenda is the trans agenda, or whatever else it may be, the LGBTQ agenda. And so these children then become pawns in their sort of political war. And I hope people don't think I'm overstating it. I think we've all seen this too often to deny that it exists. And so those teenage angst that then gets weaponized and politicized. And so in this context, yes, you can easily see how a child's complaint against a parent along those lines, that you won't let me live my life, it's hurting my feelings, you are controlling me, you're trying to change me. That's the narrative that would certainly cause a chilling effect if that child goes to school. In some schools, and tells a teacher, that every possibility that a teacher might refer it to the safeguarding officer, they might refer it to the local authority safeguarding officer, and from there it escalates. And I
Mm.
have another bit of bad news for you listeners, that this criminal offence is not the only part of this legislation. The other major part of the legislation is something called a conversion practice protection order. Now, with the main criminal offence, it has to be proven in a court beyond reasonable doubt that you committed the different aspects of the offence. But for a protection order, it's what's called the civil standard of proof, which is not beyond reasonable doubt. You just have to convince a court that it's more likely than not that this person will say or do a thing which could have this kind of conversion therapy type impact. And so that's even easier for activists to obtain, and local authorities can request these orders, not just the police, you see. So if you live in a particularly politicized local authority area, which is captured by gender ideology, that child making that complaint to the teacher, which then gets escalated to the local authority, could then result in the local authority seeking a conversion practice protection order. And the breadth of those orders is breathtaking. The court can order you as the parent to do or not to do anything it wants. And if you breach that order, that is a criminal offense. And so if they say, you must never say this phrase to your daughter again, darling, you're a beautiful girl, you're not a boy. You must never say that to the parent again. If you say that phrase, that will become the criminal offense, which could lead to up to 2-year jail penalty for you. So so I'm afraid this is very bad news. And so, the scenario, 14-year-old girl starts identifying as a boy after she watches some YouTube videos and gets locked in with an LGBTQ organization. Maybe they do a session in her school or something. She tells the parents she wants to change her name, change her pronouns. She wants to wear a breast binder. The parents just encourage you to wait and see if those feelings persist. They won't buy her a breast binder. They know that they're very bad for your health. And so when the girl tells the school all this, they report the parents to social services on the basis that they're suppressing the daughter's expression of her transgender identity, and the local authority applies for a conversion practices protection order requiring the parents to support the social transition of this child. That is a realistic scenario under this draft legislation that we've got.
Wow. I don't think I realised quite how profound and far-reaching the implications were of this legislation, Simon. To my shame, really. I think that's something that I think has shocked me and will also shock many of our listeners. And I think it's really important because although you've mentioned the trans sort of element of this, there are two things I want to dig into. So it doesn't just, and because I think we probably have more connections with folks in the public arena who were in the sort of LGB camp who would, say that, that this, a trans inclusive conversion therapy practices bill is abhorrent because we are, telling basically gay kids that they are, the opposite sex, and actually anything that we can do to just encourage their natural inclination is good, and we shouldn't be, denying parents the right to say, no, you're not a boy, you're a girl, and actually it's fine to be lesbian or whatever. So obviously we also, as Christians, would have concerns about the sexuality element of this. And what I'd like to do is just for a moment, just very briefly, perhaps take a step back and consider why this is something that Christians are concerned about. Because I think there are many, and people that I have been friends with, and people who have drawn away from perhaps Christian things because they believe that as Christians, we are just derisory and we just have homophobic or transphobic attitudes because we adopt a more traditional understanding of marriage and sexuality. Why is this important? What is it that Christians actually believe about gender and sexuality that means that this is something they would talk about in their homes, that this is something they would preach about in churches, and why it's something that even school teachers might be able to express an opinion about?
Yeah, what Christians believe, of course, is we are sex realists. So on this, we stand shoulder to shoulder with J.K. Rowling and Maya Forstater and all those other very brave people. We believe that a man cannot become a woman and a woman cannot become a man. We believe that sex is binary. And that is a clear religious belief, but let's be honest, it's a clear biological belief. And the fact that has even been brought into question says far more about problems in our society and problems with our grasp on truth and problems with the way things are argued than it says about us. So those of us as Christians who've held the line on that over the last couple of decades now find, and I could give you many examples of this, people who are not Christians who will come to you and say, wow, you guys held the line said that men can't become women, said that it will be dangerous for women's spaces and all of that 20 years ago, when we didn't even know this was a thing. But on that, as you say, we're in, that pendulum swings in place, and we are, thankfully, there's a restoration of common sense, and the more we as Christians help to get involved in that restoration of common sense, the more we'll be able to, I think, complete that process of restoring a common sense. And I don't think that's an over-optimistic thing to say. On the issue of sexuality, of course, yes, it's very different. And I think that's what you're getting at. And of course, what we believe as Christians, we believe what the Bible teaches in the Old and New Testaments, that sexual activity is reserved for marriage, and that marriage is between one man and one woman for life. And so that precludes sex before marriage, and it precludes adultery, regardless of the sex of the participants. But of course, it clearly does rule out homosexual activity, and it clearly does rule out homosexual marriage. Now, that was an uncontroversial opinion up until a few decades ago, my lifetime. And it is the mainstream, well-established, well-attested position of the Christian church for 2,000 years. It is the clear teaching of the Bible. And again, the idea that any question has been raised as to whether this is what the Christian faith teaches says more about the society's grasp on truth and the way things are argued than it says about us, because it is crystal clear. And I think Christians have been given a bad rap. We're told that, the church was homophobic in the 80s and so forth. Now, I am sure that you or I could go and find some examples of people saying some things which were over the top. I'm sure that we could find examples of people saying things that were abusive. But here's my question. Did that characterize the church's response? I don't think it did. The church, when I was converted in the late 80s in Teesside, the church was the first place where I saw people who were able to speak openly about being attracted to people of the same sex and still be treated as friends in exactly the same way as anyone else. And outside of the church, I didn't see much of that. There was hostility, but inside the church, that was there. And that's because the church is a place for people who acknowledge that they are sinners before God, whatever their sin is. And so I just want to try and, help us as Christians to recognize that our forefathers were not the villains that we're told on this, and we are not the villains that we are made out to be. I think that overwhelmingly as evangelicals, we're able to hold to these truths in a way which absolutely respects the dignity, worth, value of every individual that we speak to, and regardless of what their kind of sexual choices have been. So that's what we're trying to protect.
Sure.
We're not trying to protect the ability to be mean to anybody about anything. We're just trying to protect the ability to hold on to these beliefs. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, and to add to that, I think there's also perhaps a misunderstanding of Christians, that perhaps they just have a slightly old-fashioned or kind of pompous sense of modesty, that these things are just a bit, we don't really want to talk about them or think about them, and actually it's just a bit gross. And actually, I think what I would say is that most Christians and most churches think about these things deeply, and we have come to the conclusion actually that the Bible's teaching on marriage and sexuality isn't one that is arbitrary. It's not one that is kind of resigned to the history books and that was fine then, but is just irrelevant now. But actually, this is God's good design for flourishing, for humanity, for human relationships, for children. And that has nothing to do with, a sense of disgust for individuals. Right. It is a sense of, no, this is good for humanity. This is why we believe this. And actually, we may disagree on certain things, but we still feel that this is an important thing to talk about in society. And I think that's what I'm kind of driving at, that these things are not arbitrary. It's not just a sense of kind of, middle class disgust. Not that actually it's necessarily a middle class sort of point of view, to be honest. So I suppose, I think we need to sort of remember that we don't need to apologise for having these perspectives. We don't need to be ashamed of them. however the world would like to paint us as. And I suppose
Yeah.
we also probably need to move on to be thinking in particular now about what this means for teachers, for schools, because rightly so, the CI and many other groups as well have been talking about the danger of this legislation to ordinary pastoral conversations in church, for parents and their children, the threat that those kind of ordinary parenting decisions and conversations may be under. But why should Christians working in schools, so head teachers, teaching assistants, why should they be paying attention? What could this mean for the school environment?
So I think that, again, back to that sort of pendulum swing, I think that many people working in education will have experienced, first or at least secondhand, the way in which people sought to enforce gender ideology in the classroom. And they will have experienced the way in which their own views about sexuality and gender have been caricatured.
Yeah.
And they will have experienced the way in which, as we've discussed, that sort of language of safeguarding has been weaponized and so on. They will also have seen hopefully the pendulum swing, so back in the direction to an extent. For example, the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance, which is pretty clear that schools shouldn't be socially transitioning children without their parents being involved. If you want to correct my summary of that, please do.
Yes.
So that's the position. So this draft legislation, were it to hit the statute book in this form, would of course be pretty contradictory to that KICSI guidance. Because again, it's not difficult to imagine a scenario in which a pupil confides in a teacher that she really thinks that she is a boy. She's been speaking to some people on the internet. She's been going every Tuesday night to an LGBTQ support group. And maybe the scenario is the one that we rehearsed, where the child is complaining about her parents. The teacher then has a responsibility. In the scenario that I rehearsed, I sort of posited the teacher as the person who just accepts the child's point of view and refers it to the safeguarding officer and social services. That is the point at which you as a teacher are going to be worried. If the conversion therapy ban applies to the parents, would it apply to me if at this point in the process I became, as it were, the obstacle? So if I say to that child, actually, I think you should ask yourself whether your parents have got a point. You as a person in a position of authority are, I fear, quite open to being accused by that child and by the campaign groups working with that child. You're quite open to being accused of A, trying to make that child believe something about their gender identity. Remember, that's the first limb of the test. B, that you're exerting pressure on them because, after all, you're in a position of authority. And C, because the child doesn't get what they want, they feel very distressed. They go home. They just want to stay in bed rather than come to school. It's affecting their day-to-day life. Oops. Sounds quite a lot like you as the teacher who hasn't given that child exactly the thing that the child wants. Sounds like you as the teacher could be accused of breaking the legislation of conversion therapy, that you could be accused of abusive conversion therapy, that you could be prosecuted. Now, obviously, it would depend on the facts of an individual circumstance, but I think that teachers should be concerned about that. And I want to get to the point of really encouraging and inviting Christian professionals to engage fully in the process of the pre-legislative scrutiny of this legislation. I would plead with you to take a look at the draft legislation. I plead with you to approach Association of Christian Teachers and the Christian Institute, and there'll be others of our friends who are also working in this space. You might even prefer to engage with someone like Sex Matters, but to go to those who are working on this to get the information with a view to taking your opportunity as a professional to make a written submission to the joint committee, which is going to be doing the pre-legislative scrutiny on this bill. When that committee is finally convened, probably in September, they will almost certainly issue a call for evidence, and people will be invited to write in, to email in, to submit evidence online to that committee to help it in the drafting of its report. And that I can't emphasize enough that that is a crucial opportunity. If we can get sensible professionals who've thought about it to write thoughtful submissions to this committee, then that committee could find itself with a healthy amount of evidence from professionals, which makes them think again, which helps the people on the committee who do have questions about this legislation, which could perhaps help to change the minds of members of the committee who think that they're in favor of it. That's a key opportunity, and I would urge people to take the opportunity. And certainly with the Christian Institute, we'll be writing and emailing our own supporters with details of where to make a submission and the kind of things you should think about when you're writing that submission.
And so, from what I gather, Simon, it would be particularly useful if there are, say, teachers who have certain anecdotes. I mean, obviously, without necessarily naming names, but
No names.
situations that they would commonly come across whereby this legislation may interact, make their job more difficult, and actually not be conducive to supporting a young person, their family in school, and also may indeed, as you say, ridiculously seem to subvert the intention and the guidance that was issued in the updated Keeping Children Safe in Education,
Yes.
that statutory guidance, which did say that transition should be exceptionally rare. I'm paraphrasing. So, in essence, the implication being that after conversations, in most circumstances, children, even if they request it, will not be permitted to transition because it may not be in their best interests, which, you would imagine that would happen after a number of relatively in-depth conversations with families and the young person and teaching professionals, etc. So it does seem that there are some major blind spots here. And of course, although we don't like to overly kind of we don't want to overestimate the dangers to teaching professionals. We don't want to kind of create any panic. But this really could have implications. And we've seen already teachers who have raised concerns before. I mean, the majority of them do manage to work them out very pragmatically, particularly with support of CI or other groups. But this probably would then raise the number of people involved in certain situations, and as you say, would create that chilling effect, which is not good for the profession, and it's not good for young people either. So can you tell us then, just remind us how ACT members and other teachers can get involved in that? What do they need to look out for? When's the sort of timeline? You say September?
Yes. So, I mean, I just want to pick up on your previous point. Yes, it is absolutely true that most of the people that contact John Denning and our education team for help, most of the professionals, and even when those cases then kind of get escalated to our legal defence fund team, to Sam Webster and the others, that overwhelmingly we're able to help them negotiate a sensible, faithful, Christianly faithful kind of outcome to that situation without it. So going any further, the problem with this legislation is that it inserts the criminal law into that.
Yeah.
And so it takes it away from just whether or not you have a sympathetic head at the school, and it takes it to the realm of, well, what's the police officer going to say when he hears the story or she hears the story? That's where it starts to sort of escalate that situation. But yes, and as I said, it will be fact specific, and it might be that a teacher is able to find a way of dealing with the situation without sort of triggering those aspects of the offence. But it shouldn't even be a thing, and there shouldn't be that climate of fear. And for Christians to get involved, and I will answer the question about timing, for Christians to get involved, this is not a selfish endeavor. This is not us saying, I want to do a thing and I want you to let me do my thing because I want to do my thing, which is frankly what we often get from the other side. It's not that. It's saying we want to do our jobs. We want to do our jobs well. We want to comply with all of our safeguarding obligations, and we want to consider the best interests of these children. So it's not a selfish endeavor. It's an other-centered endeavor for us to participate in this process. So, as I say, that joint committee of Lords and Commons will likely be convened from September onwards. They will issue a call for evidence, which will be made public. We and many others will amplify that call for evidence. There will be a fairly brief window of a matter of weeks for you to draw up a written submission and to submit it formally to that committee for them to consider. The committee will then hold some oral evidence sessions where it will decide to invite some people to address the committee in person. I hope that some of those people will be educationalists. It is possible they might approach some of the people who have made written submissions and ask them to give oral evidence. I think second stage of finding the best people to represent the teaching profession and to make the best evidence-based, legally literate case, I think that's going to be very important. And then after that, the committee will go and meet in private for many weeks to draft its report. After that, there will be other opportunities. And honestly, I think that during this process, in addition to making a submission to the joint committee, I think it's important that concerned teachers are having conversations with the leadership in their schools, so that when the leadership of opportunities, they can feed into wider discussions. I also think it's important that we take opportunities to speak to our unions. I think some people will be members of unions. I know that many of those unions, I'm going to put it tactfully, they don't inspire confidence that they will be sympathetic to raising these issues. But I want to say that some unions are better than others, as far as I can tell, and that there are some people in individual unions who are better than others. And so I think that if Christian teachers can find the opportunity to raise, in a sensible way, concerns with their unions, it could have several effects. It could reduce your union's enthusiasm for backing this legislation. That would be a result, in my opinion. Or it could allow people within the union who are a bit more sensible, it could give them the data, the information points that they need to be able to at least attenuate the position of the union and maybe begin to raise some issues. Because if you could get one of the teaching unions involved in making representations on this, whether to the committee or just making public statements, which raise questions. Questions is what we need. Questions is what the democratic process needs. Questions is what scrutiny, pre-legislative scrutiny needs. So, I think we have to be realistic in this as Christians. I'm not saying that if we contact a union, we can get the union to adopt wholesale the ideal position. But if we can get them to ask questions because professionals in the union are asking them questions, I think that would be healthy.
I think that's a great point, Simon. And that's something that at ACT, we do encourage our members, whether they are, many will not be a member of one of the sort of common teaching unions, but many of them are. And the more they can raise their voice within that institution, the better, to help representation of different perspectives, because it can seem a little bit of a monoculture sometimes. But absolutely. And I think, really coming from that professional, this is my concern about my professional responsibility. I'm confused. What sort of impact might this have on my role, my kind of rights as a teacher? I mean, that's obviously what unions were set up to defend. So absolutely, I think you're spot on there, Simon. Thank you so much. Is there anything else we need to know, and where can we find out more about the Christian Institute, who are doing a lot of work behind the scenes, I know, on this as well?
Well, thank you. Yeah, the Christian Institute website, christian.org.uk. We have a dedicated page on there on the conversion therapy issue, christian.org.uk. Also, we run a campaign called Let Us Pray, letaspray.uk, which is focused in on this issue. And we'll be delighted if you want to sign up to the email lists for both of those things, because we'll certainly be keeping you up to date on these things.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Simon. Really appreciate your time.
Lovely to talk to you.